Hello, everybody. Technically it's afternoon. It's 12:01 p.m. here in Wisconsin. So good afternoon. Welcome to our spring series. We are already here, the workplace experiences of neurodivergent library workers. This is part one of two webinars we have happening in this series. So you might be wondering, why a spring series? Well, we have the Wild Wisconsin Conference in winter, we have Trustee Training Week in summer, and the Tech Days in fall. So why not a series in the spring? So we're happy to bring this to you. This is something that you will see in future years. We have Christine Moeller with us this morning. Christine is a PhD candidate from the University of Washington iSchool, and we are so excited to hear what they have to say on this very important topic. So Christine, feel free to begin.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation to be here today and to speak with all of you. I greatly appreciate that. A little bit about myself before I move on. I want to share that I am a white woman. I have chin length, blonde, wavy hair. I'm wearing a black dress, and I am wearing large stained glass sort of Gothic arch earrings that look like alluvions from the Dragon Age video game series. So if you're familiar, feel free to chat with me about that later. I also identify as neurodivergent, disabled, and queer. And that is part of what brought me to this research that I'll be talking about today. So to get us started, I wanted to make sure that you knew what we were going to cover today. So we are going to begin with some information about access and self-care during this webinar. We will review some terms and definitions to make sure we're all sort of on the same page as to what some of these things mean. I will give you an overview of the research project, and then we'll delve into some of the main themes that emerged from the work that I am doing. I will close my talk with some considerations for the profession, and I will be sure to leave some time at the end for questions and discussion. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge that everyone has needs in this space, even as we come together in a virtual space. So captioning has been enabled. You can turn that on or off according to your preference. I will work to describe slide images out loud. And this, as you heard, it is being recorded, so you'll be able to view that later. If it's helpful for you to follow along with my slides outside of watching the Zoom, you can find those at bit.ly WVLS 2024 NDL, and all of those letters are capitalized. I will also remind you that I have needs. So I may need to pause to take a drink, or I may ask for questions to be repeated. I may need time to process questions before answering. You may also notice me fidgeting or stimming today. So I invite you to think about how you can care for your needs in this virtual space today. I will also note that we have to remember about self-care during this time as well. And on this slide, there are two images. One is of lit candles softly flickering, and the other is a very close-up nose of a tabby cat, because this wouldn't be a library presentation without at least one cat image. But I want to remind you all that depending on your background and your experiences, you may identify with some of the things that I am talking about. So if you need a break for any reason, please feel free to step away and care for yourself as you need, and come back later to that recording at your leisure. All right, so I wanted to begin with some terms and definitions so that we make sure that we understand how I'm defining these things for my research. Neurodiversity is a contested term. So sometimes people use it to refer to what they see as a biological fact. Other times it refers to an ideology. Sometimes it refers to a social movement. But the word originates from the attempt to name the idea that some minds, ways of being are assumed to be normal, while others are not. And so this originated in the idea that neurological differences are really just another aspect of human variation. And so neurodiversity includes numerous forms of neurological differences, such as autism and ADHD, but also things like dyspraxia, dyslexia, OCD, Tourette's, brain injury, epilepsy, and many more. And neurodiversity as a term typically includes both neurotypical and neurodivergent. And neurotypical are those whose minds align with dominant social norms and expectations, and thus they get to be considered typical. And neurodivergent are those whose minds do not align with dominant social norms and expectations. And that's sometimes also called neurodistinct. You may hear neuroatypical. Some people like neurospicy. This language is in constant flux and preferences vary. So when in doubt, it's always best to ask someone what their preferred language is. You may also have heard about person first and identity first language. People sort of often ask me which one of these is best. So person first language, if you aren't familiar with this, is as in person with a disability. And that was adopted in the 1970s in resistance to the stigma of disability in order to place the emphasis on the importance of the person and all the various facets of their identity. Now, since then, disability advocates and disability scholars have kind of critiqued this construction and saying that it reinforces the stigma to some degree. If you have to claim your personhood, then it seems like that disability is somehow dehumanizing. So that led to identity first language, as in disabled person or autistic person. And that flips the person first language construction in order to emphasize disability or other characteristics as a positive aspect of a person's identity, just like you would with other aspects of your identity, right? If you're a creative person, we put that adjective first. So as a neurodivergent researcher myself, I have carefully chosen language throughout this research that aligns with the general preferences of neurodivergent people and best practices in neuroinclusive research. So I will use identity first language throughout my presentation today. But I also want to remind you that some groups, such as people with intellectual disabilities, may still prefer person-first language. So again, this is another case where if you aren't sure, it's always best to ask. All right, so now that we've defined some terms, I'll tell you a little bit about the goals and purpose and introduce you to my research project. So the research that I'm talking about today is part of a larger initiative at UW that brings together practitioners and advocates and is working to create meaningful employment for neurodivergent people. I am the PhD lead on an IMLS-funded grant project called Empowering Neurodivergent Librarians. That's led by Dr. Hala Anavi, who is also the director of the UW Neurodiversity Initiative, and is co-led by Dr. Michelle Martin, who is just coming off of being the director of our MLAS program. And so she's been joining us in that capacity. The reason I'm doing this research is because librarianship is a field that appears to be appealing, there we go, to neurodivergent people. And library literature has largely overlooked the existence of neurodivergent library workers, focusing mostly on neurodivergent patrons and how we might better serve them. Additionally, core values like access and equity are not consistently practiced in library workplaces. So this project then is focused on improving the capacity of libraries to recruit, onboard, retain, and advance neurodivergent librarians. And this project is aiming at distributing responsibility across the team, right? Building the capacity of managers and library directors rather than burdening neurodivergent library workers with all of the work of educating their colleagues. An important aspect of this project is that we are intentionally doing research differently. Historically, neurodiversity research has been done to neurodivergent people from a medicalized perspective, often focusing on like diagnosis and characteristics and how to like make some kind of intervention for the individual and their behaviors in some manner, like change them or alter them. This study is intentionally working in opposition to that and adopting a neurodiversity and critical disability studies approach to conducting research with and by neurodivergent people themselves. So the focus isn't on individuals here, but on the structural changes that we can make in order to improve the lives of neurodivergent people in alignment with their perspectives and the things that are important to them. Doing that then means hearing from neurodivergent librarians. And so I have conducted 50 interviews with neurodivergent librarians. 33 of those were with librarians and 17 of those were with library supervisors. And this included both public and academic libraries. It did lean a little toward academic libraries, but there was really good representation here from public libraries as well. These interviews will be informing a nationwide survey that we are in the stages of finalizing right now, so it is coming very soon. So please stay tuned for more details on that. Obviously today I'll be talking then about the findings from these 50 interviews. So across those interviews, several large themes emerged. The first was the workplace barriers and enablers of inclusion that neurodivergent librarians experienced in their workplaces. The second was this process of negotiating identity as a neurodivergent person. The third was the challenges and strengths of being a neurodivergent supervisor. And the fourth was really about the nature of librarianship and the profession itself. So first we'll look at workplace and barriers and enablers to neuroinclusion. So the librarians that I talked with shared that they encountered numerous barriers in their workplaces that made them feel excluded. So these included things like negative stereotypes and stigma. They were worried about being discriminated against, and some of them had experienced that in their workplaces, so that fear was very real for them. They often felt isolated professionally or even socially in their workplaces, and they found that there were many aspects of their work environment that were inaccessible. And that's not just in terms of the physical environment, but also things like the sensory environment or the amount of distractions that were constantly around their working space. They also talked about how workplace expectations were not always clear, and they often didn't realize that certain expectations existed until they bumped up against them and got feedback that they were doing something wrong. Many of them also felt that differences, especially their differences, were not welcome in their workplaces. And for those who were seeking accommodations, who decided to take that step, they found that the process was very unclear. Some people didn't know who they were supposed to talk to, and the process was also highly bureaucratic for them as well. Many of them also talked about how it became their responsibility as the neurodivergent person in their workplace to continually educate their colleagues, like their supervisor or their library director, who were unaware of neurodiversity or held misconceptions about that. Additionally, they found that they talked about how these barriers were magnified with other intersecting identities. And so people experienced these barriers in more intense ways or in more specific ways, depending on other aspects of their identity as well. The good news is there were things that were enabling inclusion for the library workers. And these included things like the ability to have some flexibility around their schedule, options to sometimes work remotely or have some hybrid work options, and the ability to have autonomy in their work, in their day-to-day work, and be self-directed. They also placed emphasis on how much it meant to have a supportive supervisor and team. And many of them asked for and wished for a private workspace where they could have that control over the sensory environment. And when they needed a break or some time to just decompress or recover from something, that they had that door that could be closed and had that privacy. They also emphasize needing respect for their boundaries and mental health support. And that could be things like health insurance, but it was also things like being reminded or encouraged to actually use your PTO or your vacation time, whatever it's called at your organization. They also talked a lot about how much it meant to them to be at a workplace where everyone was able to bring their strengths to their library work. And for those who had a neurodivergent supervisor, they spoke to what it meant to them to have someone who had that lived experience and that kind of understanding and could approach that supervisory relationship from that lived experience perspective. So next I will talk about negotiating identity in this process of exploring one's own neurodivergence. And the reason this is particularly important in my research is because so many people are coming to a later understanding of their neurodivergence. 86% of the librarians that I spoke with had identified their neurodivergence as adults. They were often coming to this recognition through friends, social media, memes, and TikToks. These are the things they were telling me about. And that's because obtaining diagnosis as an adult is extremely complicated. There aren't that many people who have the ability to diagnose adults. The focus is largely on children. And so sometimes this is nearly impossible. There are year-long waiting lists, and people talked about how they would have to drive all the way across their state to get an official diagnosis. So the reason this matters is because people haven't necessarily had this understanding or had support in this area or this aspect of their identities. And so that meant that they were still working to identify their own needs and their authentic ways of being in the world. And they were still engaged in this ongoing process of learning how to unmask and unlearning behaviors and attitudes toward themselves that had been harmful. They also talked about how they had become so accustomed to adapting on their own that they really struggled to imagine other possibilities or to know what to ask for or how others might support them. And so they had often relied on masking or concealing their neurodivergent ways of being in their workplaces. But that had serious impacts on physical and mental well-being and things like work-life balance, and was often leading toward or creating a burnout situation. Neurodivergent supervisors experience many of these same challenges and barriers and enablers as their library colleagues. However, they also emphasized the strengths that they brought to leadership positions, to positions of authority in libraries for themselves, for others, and especially for the profession as well. So they talked about how they felt that they were able to be more understanding of differences because of their lived experiences. And they found that made them empathetic towards their direct reports. They especially emphasize so much more than the librarians, and this makes sense, right, given their leadership position, but they talk so much about how they use the power of their role to create change in their organization, whether that was policies or even as the next item shows, right, as supervisors, they were finding that they could support neurodivergent library workers and even hire them and recognize their strengths in ways that they felt maybe might not have been the case from someone with a different perspective. And they also stress the importance of advancing more neurodivergent librarians into supervisory roles to offer new perspectives and to advance the profession. All right, so next I want to talk about the nature of librarianship as a service-oriented profession. I also need to take a sip of coffee here for a moment, so I'm going to do that as I'm changing the slide here. So one of the things that came out during these interviews is that librarianship as a service-oriented profession that is focused on helping others and meeting their information needs is a field and a professional value system that aligned particularly well with the values and career desires of neurodivergent librarians. They all spoke to me about how much they loved helping other people and how much satisfaction it brought them to see the impact of those efforts. They also acknowledged, however, that librarians are doing this work of including patrons, and so they were often practicing inclusion for their library communities, but not finding that they were able to experience that same sort of inclusion in their workplaces. They also discussed how the service orientation combined with historic underfunding and understaffing and often retention issues as well was resulting in self-sacrifice as an expected norm. And so they described being overworked and expected to wear too many hats. Many of them were taking on the work of their colleagues who had left. And so again, these are other factors that were contributing to burnout. And as one of my participants observed, librarians aren't known for boundaries. And so much of this work was being taken on top of other responsibilities and creating a really unsustainable workload, something many of you may be experiencing as well. This is something that probably is about the profession itself, right? Rather than something that's potentially unique to the neurodivergent librarians. Although I think the impact of that, because of the ways that there are the other burnout factors there, this is compounding some of those other factors. And as one of my participants said, I think right now at this moment in libraries, there's a feeling of we're doing so much to keep up, to try to survive and adapt, and it's never enough. And so these are issues with the profession that are particularly impacting neurodivergent librarians. The thing I want to emphasize today, though, is that neurodivergent librarians are already part of our profession, and they have so much to offer both the profession and the library communities that we're all working to support. So as they themselves said, we're already here, we are engaged, and we care about the work that we're doing, and we care about this profession. Just make it a little easier for us, and we have so much to give. We want to be in this field. It just needs to be easier. Let us help advance the field. People do well when they can. If they're not meeting an expectation, maybe we should look at our expectation. So generally speaking, the neurodivergent librarians who participate in this research really do believe that their peers are well-intentioned, but they also recognize that workplaces do not become inclusive on good intentions alone. So next then, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we might make things easier and how we might examine our expectations and work toward that goal of creating more neuro-inclusive library workplaces. So I will take a moment to mention that as part of our IMLS grant-funded project, we will be creating a toolkit later this year that will include things like education and training and resources that libraries and MLS programs will be able to use free of charge. So please stay tuned for additional details on that. In the meantime, however, I think it's important that we keep in mind that given that librarianship may be a field that is particularly appealing to neurodivergent people, what can we do to welcome and support them? And one step toward that is enacting some of those enablers that I discussed earlier in our workplaces. And maybe you can't do all of these, but even being able to make a little bit of movement on one of these areas would help. So for example, one of the things I talked about was how many people wanted a private workspace. And libraries often, right, I heard about libraries where no one had a workspace because none of those workspaces for library workers were built into that library. And so that's sometimes the reality of our spaces. And so maybe that's not a reality, but maybe you could do something like one of the public librarians that I spoke with talked about that they had done at their library. And they had repurposed a small room at their library to be a recovery space that all of the staff could use whenever they needed to. So there was a private space then for that neurodivergent library worker. If they were feeling overwhelmed and just needed some few quiet moments in a dark space. I know I need those sometimes. That space was there for that. But then it was also there for the library worker who had maybe had a difficult or emotional interaction with a patron and really needed some time to recover or decompress or whatever words are applied there, right? So that space could be used by everyone. It sort of multi-purpose needs, but really helped staff have those space to step away for a moment so that they could recover and then come back to their work. And that's something that maybe you might consider, right? So this doesn't have to be an all or nothing. That's basically what I'm saying. There are ways to make progress on some of these things that can make a difference for actually everyone at your library. So those are some of the enablers. And as you might imagine then, the other thing that we could address then potentially is some of the barriers to inclusion. And you could think about maybe removing them, or again, this isn't all or nothing either, right? How could we maybe minimize some of these barriers? Things like stereotypes, stigma, are you stepping in and addressing those when they happen? Do you know what aspects of your work environment might be inaccessible for the library workers there? Are you familiar with the accommodations process at your libraries? It turns out that many people aren't. Many of the neurotypical librarians I spoke with also had no idea what that process looks like. So having that conversation as a team would serve several purposes. It would both make everyone aware of what the process is, so that if someone was interested in requesting accommodations, there'd be some transparency around how to do that. It also helps normalize some of these things, right? If we've talked about it, if everybody knows what the process is, then it makes it seem like it's not this like secret thing that you need a special ticket to or an invitation to access. It becomes a normal part of being at work, and everyone has a clear understanding of that. So those are some of the kinds of things that you might be able to think about in terms of minimizing some of those barriers that the librarians are encountering in their workplaces. I have also created some additional questions that you can reflect on yourselves, or you can use to facilitate these kinds of conversations at your own library workplace. I'm actually going to give you a minute to read through these, and then I'll talk through them. That will also enable me to grab another sip of coffee. So as you might have seen on the previous slide, and as I talked about earlier, the librarians that I spoke with were often carrying the burden of educating their colleagues. But if you aren't familiar with neurodiversity, what would you or the other people at your libraries like to know? Webinars like this are obviously a great place to get started. But are there other things beyond what you're hearing today that you feel like would be helpful for you to know more about this, so you could work toward that goal of creating your work, a more neuro-inclusive workplace? Additionally, given how many librarians talked about unclear expectations or unclear processes, what knowledge is taken for granted at your institution, and how can that be shared with everyone? And again, this is one of those things where it may not be easy to identify yourself. And so this is really a good topic for conversation, so that other people can help identify those areas where they have knowledge of things that maybe they didn't realize when they first started at your library. That could be a good way of identifying those things. And related to this is the idea of improving that clarity and transparency around expectations at your library. Things like meeting practices. One of the librarians I spoke with was on a meeting practices task force, because they realized that they had never had conversations about how they come together and what the expectations are in those spaces. And so they were actually working on establishing meeting norms and being transparent about what those were for everyone. You could imagine doing the same sort of thing with some of your workflows or potentially preferred communication methods. This is especially important at libraries where there are like multiple channels for communication. Some of the librarians I spoke with, their library were using email, but then they were also using like Google Chat or Teams or Slack. And so sometimes it was unclear which conversations went in which space, or uncertainty about when to communicate via which channel. So making those things clear will not just help your neurodivergent librarians, but it will actually help everyone at your workplace have those clearer understandings of what to use and when. And then my final question is thinking through how you can build on the strengths of your team in a way that's healthy for everyone. And that last part, right, healthy for everyone, is particularly important there, especially related to understaffing and retention issues. It's important that people bring their strengths to their position in a way that's sustainable and not additive. And what I mean by that is that, actually, let me use an example from one of the librarians that I spoke with. I spoke with a librarian who was amazing at statistics and loved it, which congratulations, I think that's amazing. It's not my area of expertise, but this person was fabulous at it. And they worked at a library where they had been collecting lots of data, but they weren't really sure what to do with it, but they knew that they needed to report some of that information. And so they called on this person, and this person agreed to do that work for them. But the issue was for this person that this was a huge project with like 20 years worth of statistical data that was kind of a mess that they were trying to make sense of. And they were doing that still on top of all of their existing library work. And so this was an instance where, yes, they were building on the strengths of that person, but they were doing that in a way that wasn't sustainable, right? So it became actually something that was a real imposition on that person, and was impacting their work-life balance and their well-being. So it's really important that when we think about those strengths, we do that in a way that makes sense for the work of the library, for the library team, and is healthy for all of the people at the library, so that we are sustaining them in the workplace rather than adding factors that may contribute to burnout in their career. One of my participants early on noted that no one ever asks you what you prefer. No one ever asks you what's your ideal work environment. And I think that's sometimes because there's a perception like, here is the only office we have for you, or here is the one desk that's open. But there are other aspects of the work environment that we could potentially consider as well. And so this is just a moment to sort of reflect on whether you have asked anyone this question, or if someone asked you this question, would you know how to answer? What is your ideal work environment? What contributes to your success in your library work? I know I find that challenging to come up with myself. So this is an invitation for you to consider what works best for you. Not that we can always meet all of those things, but again, how can we work toward creating that workspace that is more inclusive? Some steps that you can take toward that are things that hopefully you're already doing for each other and for the best of your library organization. That's things like assuming competence and addressing stereotypes and stigma as they occur, just as you probably are already doing if you're hearing microaggressions in your workplace, right? It's that same sort of thing. And when collaborating, discuss how to best work together. I think we're often sort of thrown together in collaborations, and we may not always remember to sort of step back and say, wait, how do you work best? Are you a person who, like me, likes to get things done super early and be really on top of things? Are you a person who works better under pressure? How can we sort of work together in a way that we can bring our best to this work together? Managers, supervisors, you obviously be doing those same things, but there are some things that are specific to your role that you can do as well. That's things like asking everyone about their workplace needs, about how they can be successful in their library position, whether that's their preferred method of communication, things that might be helpful in terms of their workspace, and then following through on those conversations so that actions follow up those discussions. And then thinking about how to facilitate all of the workers bringing their strengths to library work. And then also, having some familiarity with informal and formal accommodations processes. I know there are certain rules at workplaces. I've heard about some people not being allowed to have informal or to offer informal accommodations, but knowing where those sort of lines are at your workplace, even that is helpful for those who are interested in that process. And the other thing I will say here is that The practices that create neuroinclusive workplaces are generally best practices for managers, for supervisors, for things that will improve the health of your library organization, and create situations on workplaces where everyone is able to bring their strengths and the passion that I know we all feel about librarianship to this really important work that libraries do for their communities. So that then brings us to the end of my presentation, because I wanted to make sure we had lots of time for questions and discussion. Before we get to that, though, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank everyone who participated in these interviews, and the many, many people who are on the waiting list hoping to participate, who are all willing to share their stories with me. Sorry, I'm going to get emotional for a moment, but these stories and this experience of doing this research have really changed my life, both personally and professionally, and that's really not exaggerating. So thank you for everyone who participated, and I want to thank all of you for being here today, and all of you who are watching the recording of this. Thank you for your interest in this. And please know that I am still sort of at the early stages of this work. So there is much more to come. As you heard, we'll be releasing a nationwide survey soon. So if you want to know more about that, or you have questions that you'd like to follow up with me afterwards, you are welcome to contact me at neurodiversity@uw.edu. That's the email address you see here. That will reach out to me and my whole research team. And you are welcome to reach out at any time. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and open things up for questions. And I think I will be handing things back to Jamie now.
All right, thank you, Christine. We have a lot of questions that came in. Leah, if you could type Christine's email in the chat, that would be awesome. I think it was, what was that again? neurodiversity@uw.edu?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. In the case we don't get to everybody's questions today, Christine, thank you, Leah. Christine is happy to take them. We have quite a few that came in, so I'm going to get started. First of all, a comment came in. Thank you so much for this work. It's really important and appreciated. Was there attention paid during this survey conversation about whether participants were out as neurodivergent at work? I'm curious how that impacts the barriers or enablers.
Yeah, that's a great question. So during the interviews, a lot of people shared that they had not disclosed at their workplace, or they had engaged in what I call selective disclosure. So they might disclose aspects of their neurodivergence that they felt might be understood. So and I think what that was sort of depended on where the kinds of conversations that people were having at their workplace. So one example of that might be like social anxiety. Sometimes people felt like that was more accepted, especially in a profession where there are lots of us more introverted types, right? There was an understanding of that. So they might disclose those sorts of things without fully disclosing all the aspects of their identity, or this neurodivergent aspect of their identity. Or they might, if they were seeking some kind of informal or formal accommodations, then they would, disclose to a supervisor in order to help facilitate that process. But there were also some people who were very open with their colleagues about their neurodivergence. So, it's kind of all over in terms of range there. And at some places where there were multiple neurodivergent workers, I think that helped people be more likely to be open about that aspect of their identity because they felt that they were part of an understanding community. So that was actually another important aspect of this research, was realizing how much having that neurodiversity community at work helped people be more open about their identity and think more about how to make their workplaces better for everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
How do issues of mental health, such as anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, fit in with the discussion of neurodiversity?
Yeah, they are extremely important to our discussion of neurodiversity. One of the things that I talk about in my research, and that a number of my participants mentioned as well, is this idea that neurodiversity is only one aspect of a person's identity, right? It doesn't occur in isolation or is like this, it doesn't overwhelm all of the other aspects of our identity. And neurodivergent people often experience other things as well, physical disabilities, invisible disabilities, and anxiety and depression are high on that list as well. And this is especially for the people that I spoke with, right? Because they don't have, many of them have lived the majority of their lives without this understanding of themselves. And that has led to depression and high anxiety about how others perceive them, especially in that professional context. So those are really important. And that's why I put mental health, right, as one of those things that we need to understand and have that support for in the workplace, because that's a very real issue for neurodivergent library workers, as it is for many other people as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How would you approach a situation when a staff member has identified a strategy that works for that person, although that accommodation could negatively impact customer service? An example of this is having to watch YouTube videos at a service desk with audio on without headphones in order to concentrate.
Yeah, I think, it's hard to know like what the volume is and what they're watching. And so, without a lot of information about the very specifics of that situation, it's hard for me to say, here's what you should do. However, I think it's always worth having conversation and recognizing that this is always an ongoing process of negotiation. I talked about how in my work, I come from a critical disability studies perspective. And one thing that critical disability studies talks about is conflicts of access. And I think this is very much an example of that, right? The idea that what someone needs to do their work may be something that's very, very loud. And maybe that's in a space where it needs to be quieter, right? There needs to be fewer distractions. And so that's an area then where we talk about like, this is a process of negotiation. So what is it that that person needs, and how can we meet that need in a way that also doesn't create that distraction, that loud environment that's going to be a problem for someone else. And so, it's again, having these conversations, being able to say, here's why we might not be able to do that. What else can we do instead? Let's work together to come up with that happy medium, so that we can meet needs in a way that doesn't become a problem.
Thank you. So this next question, it's two questions, I think from two different people, but I'll ask them together. I'm curious if you'd considered including the experiences of library assistants, pages, and other roles. It seems that we could really benefit from people in these roles and their voices being heard. And then another question related to that is this work focused on librarians only? About 1% of our staff are librarians and 75% are assistants.
Yeah, so I will say that for our grant is part of the IMLS Laura Bush 21st Century Librarians Program. I think I have all those words right and in the correct order. So we did need to have kind of a focus on librarians. However, what we did was we created a rather large and nebulous definition. We didn't really define librarian intentionally because we recognized that at so many workplaces, people are doing that kind of work without that designation in their title, often even without the MLIS degree, right? So we didn't really require any of those things to participate. And so that means we did have people from tech services, for example, circulation, right, who participated in our interviews and who we expect will participate in our survey as well. So that was kind of how we negotiated that, trying to both align with the expectations of our grant, but recognizing that so many people do library work without having that specific name librarian in their role or in their description.
Thank you.
And again, I will say, right, this is only a first step. We know that there is much more research to do in this area. And so the goal here really is to have some meaningful foundation so that other people can come and do this work as well in many of these areas that were named in that particular question.
Thank you. How will you know that your staff person is neurodivergent? I've always thought you really can't ask people. If they don't tell you, can you ask? If an employee does not share that they are neurodivergent, how do we start that conversation, or even should we?
Yeah, one thing I will say here is you don't necessarily need to know. You definitely don't want to ask people things, especially if you're sort of making an assumption there. But what you can do is, as I was talking about on, I think it was my next to last slide, where I was talking about having some of those conversations with all library workers, yes, about their needs. That's the kind of thing you can do so that you aren't singling out employees or making them feel uncomfortable about the things that you may have noticed about their differences in the workplace. The thing you can do is normalize having these kinds of conversations with everyone. And that way you'll find out what everyone's needs are, as well as the needs of the person who you might want to have some specific conversations with. That's the best way into those kinds of conversations. Should be talking with everyone.
Thank you. What are some best practices for providing accommodations in advance for neurodiverse individuals in larger gathering spaces, like at a workshop or conference?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I really appreciate that because conferences can be nightmares for a lot of us. But I do want to step back for a moment and be clear that we all have different forms of neurodivergence, and we all have very different ways of being, and no one neurodivergent person is the same as another. And so that creates some challenges. I recognize people, as librarians, we like our checklists. And I know that it's really helpful to be able to go through things like that and have some clear expectations and to know what to do when you do want to do well and support people. I think the best thing to do is to go out to something like Ask Jan, which is the Job Accommodations Network, and look at some of the things that they recommend as accommodations. For conferences, there are all sorts of resources available for making more inclusive, disability inclusive more broadly, right? But also neurodiversity inclusive conferences. So take advantage of those kinds of resources because there's a lot of information out there that will help you decide what works best for your organization and your context. And we don't have to like recreate the wheel here.
Thank you.
Oh, yes. And thank you to the person who's sharing the link to Ask Jan in the chat.
Thank you, Mark.
If you aren't sure what to ask for, it's great as well.
This was a question in the chat area. Does anybody have recommendations for changes to wording and library policies to include those that are uncomfortable with terminology that was typical in the past? Christine, I wanted to check with you on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, if it's terminology, I'm not sure, what exactly the person is referring to here, but if it's terminology that's no longer common, like, is there a reason you're still using it? And if so, maybe it's helpful to define it. One of the things that I heard a lot from people is even if there are policies that can't be changed, it helps to understand why. So again, I think this is maybe an issue of transparency in terms of making, just having that conversation and being clear about what words mean and how they're being used in that particular policy. I know that's kind of general, but I hope that helps to some degree.
Okay. So Christine, we are almost out of time. Are you able to stick around for about 5 minutes over? Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I can do that.
Thank you. So we'll try to get to everything that has been submitted so far. So as we support more work from home and flex scheduling, frontline desk workers have had less backup support when they get busy, and this can cause more stress when staff are on desk. And this can cause coworker resentment and feelings of favoritism. Most of us are short-staffed, so how do supervisors manage the needs of everybody?
Yeah, that's a great question. I spoke to a lot of people who are also at situations where there are retention issues and they're struggling to keep branches open, and one person is out sick and a branch has to close. So I know this is a very real issue right now in libraries. And I don't say, I don't think I have the best answer. I don't know how to fix that piece of things. What I can say is what I heard from people is that it really helps to just have supervisors who acknowledge, like, this sucks. This is hard. We know that this is creating anxiety and stress. And here's why we're doing things this way. Again, I think this is another situation where, as I just mentioned, it's really important for people to understand why these things are happening and why they are being asked to experience this stress and anxiety. And if you kind of explain that, then often that goes a long way towards making people feel like you at least recognize that anxiety and stress. If it is also causing exorbitant amounts of anxiety and stress, then it might be useful to think about where are there other areas where you might remediate that stress? Are there opportunities to offer some recovery moments for people to help reduce some of that stress? Are there other things that you can make less stressful? Are there opportunities to provide some of that mental health support that I talked about, or to remind people to take advantage of their PTO? I think, when things are short-staffed, people often feel bad knowing that it will cause their coworkers that kind of anxiety and stress. And so how do we sort of balance those things? Can be particularly challenging, but often having that conversation as a team can help everyone at least feel like that's recognized, and that there's some transparency around that.
So thank you. So were the librarians you interviewed hopeful about the changes taking place?
I think they felt like even small changes would make a huge difference. They talked a lot about how they're trying so hard all the time. And if someone like, I think even one of my participants, I'm not going to get the exact quote right, but one of my participants said something about like, we're giving 100% all the time. Like if you could just give us 25% so we could get down to 75%, that would make such an immense difference. And so I think, they're very committed to the profession. And I think they felt like one of those people, one of the librarians that I had quoted said, if it could just be a little bit easier, it would make such an immense difference. And so I think that's the piece that they were hopeful about, because it felt like it's probably feasible if we could just have this conversation and people could understand how to do that work of making it just a little bit easier. That it would have a great impact, not only for the neurodivergent librarians, but for everyone on those library teams.
Thank you. 2 questions left. Any tips for managers who want to make accommodations for neurodivergent workers, but do not have the support for their director? Or do we just ask about accommodations needed and leave it at that?
Yeah, I mean, this can be tricky. And so, I don't want to ask anyone to like put their job on the line here or anything. I will share with you, I've also interviewed a lot of neurotypical supervisors as well. I haven't reported on that research yet. But what I have heard is the various strategies in response to this kind of situation. Some people were adopting I will do it, and then if I find out that that was wrong, I will apologize later kind of approach to that sort of thing. And other people were trying to sort of be that middle negotiation point. In other words, maybe sort of pushing back a little bit against leadership while trying to make some progress in terms of the kinds of informal accommodations that they could offer. In other words, sort of taking on a more advocate role with the leadership as well. And I won't tell you what's right. I think that's up to you and knowing your organization and your position and your role in your organization. But I offer those as some kind of strategies for sort of being in that middle kind of position.
Thank you. All right, last question. It has to do with your research. Where should we look for the nationwide survey once it opens? And do you have info on where we can go if we want to be part of your work and survey research?
Yeah, so if you want to participate in the survey, send that email to neurodiversity@uw.edu and ask to be added to our contact list. We also have a website, which I probably should have had ready and put up on my slides, but let me look it up real quickly. And I will add it to the chat for anybody who's still around. And then can maybe make that available after the discussion as well. And there it is. For those of you who are listening, it's sites.uw.edu/neurodiversity. And you can find the Empowering Neurodivergent Librarians project on that page under the Research Projects tab. Sorry, that's a little complicated.
That's okay. We'll include that email in the follow-up.
Perfect.
Wow. Thank you, Christine, for the information. Thank you to all of you for participating, staying with us, for all your questions. If it looked like I should have said this, if it looked like I was looking away, I was watching my other screen for questions. I didn't want to miss any. So what a great presentation and conversation. So For those of
Thank
who
you
wanna-
to everyone who stuck around long to go through these questions with us. I see you and I appreciate you hanging out with us.
Remember, we have another presentation on May 7th on this topic with Renee Grazi. There is still availability in that, so feel free to register for that presentation as well. There will be a short survey at the end today. It will also show up in your email. So again, thank you, Christine. Thank you, Leah. Thank you to all of you for being here today. I hope you have a great rest of your day and week. And so long.